Welcome back to another episode of Security Insights, where the best practices of cybersecurity meet the real-world workplace. My name is Chris Goettl, and as always, joining me today, Robert Waters. Robert, welcome back. Today, we've got an interesting kickoff to the next couple episodes. Walk us through it.
You bet. So today's topic is pretty self-explanatory, I think, when I say it. It's the top 10 problems with vulnerability management. So we are going to count them down from 10 to 1, a la David Letterman, but they're not actually in ranked order, like his might have been. So they all apply perhaps equally or differently at different organizations, depending on which of these practices you follow. But without further ado, let's get right into it. So number 10 on our list of the top 10 problems with vulnerability management is a lack of comprehensive asset inventory, otherwise stated as limited attack surface visibility. So, listeners, viewers might be surprised at how many teams we still hear about that track their asset inventory via spreadsheets, or they might only have visibility of traditional perimeter assets, their servers, their endpoints, those type of things. So they know their known knowns, if you will. They know every employee has a laptop. They know they got some printers in their offices. They know they got servers in their data center. Maybe they know their known unknowns. Hey, we know we've got some IoT devices in this warehouse, but we don't have visibility of them. We don't manage them. They definitely don't know their unknown unknowns. No one does. You've got, again, that might be IoT, it might be cloud services, cloud workloads. It might be third-party assets at a customer that you have tightly synced, systems with. And one blind spot is all it takes to take down, an organization. So, Chris, anything you want to impart on number 10?
Yeah, I think depending on the type of organization you are and where your organization has spent time on this, some of these examples will feel very, very common to you. You've got an asset management program. It's more of a point in time. We update it maybe a couple of times a year. New assets get added to it, but we don't refresh anything in there. There's the CMDB, your ITSM side. I've rarely talked to an organization who truly says, yes, we think the CMDB is our asset management source of truth, right? It's oftentimes stagnant as well. When you start to get into the security conversation, there's been a trend over the last couple of years where the security team has been taking a more vested interest in the asset state of the environment. And in one of we'll do a follow-up episode talking more about how do we solve some of these problems. But basically, the security team either has a chair at the table of the asset conversation or has taken over their own asset initiative to get better visibility around this. But at the end of the day, Robert, you mentioned a couple of terms in there. Known, like these are assets I know about with exposures that I need to be concerned about. The known unknowns means I've got an asset out there that I know about, but I don't know what vulnerabilities I'm exposed to because of that. And then there's the unknown unknowns, like what else don't I even have visibility into? Today, traditionally, companies' vulnerability management program really only tackles the known, unless you have a very tightly coupled asset management in your vulnerability management strategy. You're not extending into that known unknown and unknown category. So discovery, asset management, blind spots are definitely leaving you exposed to that vulnerability management challenge within your environment.
For sure. Moving on, number 9 on our list of top 10 problems with vulnerability management is an inaccurate view of exposure. So due to that aforementioned limited attack surface visibility, if you don't know about an asset, you won't know about its exposures.
Right.
And this can be due, to a lot of other reasons too. You might have scanners that are missing plugins and detection signatures for vulnerability. So you have a new vulnerability in your environment, but your scanners haven't been updated to catch it yet. Those are all sorts of problems that we see here. And another one I think is false findings. Chris, do you want to talk on that a little?
Yeah. So one of the really frustrating things is when you've got multiple sources of information and those don't align. Which one of them is the source of truth? Well, within organizations, it's typically you've got the two sources. You've got your vulnerability scanner and you've got your patch management solution. And the security team always stakes their trust on the vulnerability scan, the IT team on the patch management solutions results. Who's right at the end of the day, right? So we've got multiple sources of what is reality in our environment, and those don't always agree. Now, I've been working in the vulnerability and patch management space for over 20 years now. And one thing that I have found over time is you will always have false findings in your purview. So it could be that, so Robert, if you got the December OS update for your system, and then January, you happen to be out of the office for a couple of weeks because you were doing a, post holiday, vacation. You didn't get a good vacation over the holiday break, so you decided to take one after. Well, you missed the maintenance window for January. Come February, you got the February update. The vulnerability scanner might still say you're exposed to something from January because they were looking for a registry key that didn't get applied to your system. Now, because the OS update is cumulative, when you applied February, you were good. But that's just one example of where that can happen. Let's take an example on the patch management side. I scan systems in my environment and I find that, hey, everything's up to date. Well, the security team comes back and says, no, you've got this Java vulnerability out here. The IT team looks at it and says, well, Java's not even installed on this system. How do I have a Java vulnerability? If we go and apply that with the patch management solution, what you end up with is an up-to-date version of Java runtime, and that vulnerability is still in place. Why? Because that Java vulnerability was actually a Java DLL integrated in some other homegrown solution that you can't just update directly, but the scanner finds it. So you've got all of these findings that are out there that require a lot of assessment. How do we figure out what is the actual course of action to resolve these things? So when we say false findings, a lot of times it comes down to all of those layers of ambiguity after the easy things are taken care of. And unfortunately, that is a rather large pile of those findings are in that ambiguity state.
100%. Those are great examples. And with that, we'll jump to number 8 on our list of the top 10 problems with vulnerability management. That's data overload. So more assets pop up in environments every single year and a more diverse mix of those assets. And you also are seeing exponential growth in the number of known CVEs discovered every year. And you can't, in addition to that, ignore the old ones that are 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 years old. They pile up on top of each other, growing every year. And then there's just the sheer volume of data generated by vulnerability scans, which can be overwhelming for security teams. So, Chris, I don't know if you want to speak on how, this is really a problem for teams dealing with this.
Yeah, I've worked with organizations where they'll send me, hey, we're trying to figure out how we get to as close as possible to compliance as quickly as possible. So the security team generates a vulnerability report with hundreds of thousands of rows of findings. And then they pass that over to the IT team and they're like, go fix all of this. Well, the IT team really just needs to go and apply a handful of updates to resolve most of that. So think about this. On average, your Windows or Mac OS update each month is going to resolve somewhere between 30 and 50 CVEs on average. Every week, you've got a Google Chrome update, and that means you've also got an Edge update because that's Chromium-based. And each of those is averaging somewhere between 8 to 10 CVEs as well. Throw in a few other third-party applications, and suddenly every single month, every system in my environment is throwing a couple of hundred additional findings onto that report. If we're behind even a little bit, if I'm 3 OS updates out of date, that could be several hundred CVEs on its own. But the reality is all of these updates are cumulative. You give me that line or that report with the hundreds of thousands of findings. If we do the mapping correctly, coming out the other end, you might only have to apply 5 or 6 updates to get the majority of those taken care of. So the data overload when it comes to this is, it can get astronomical very quickly. We didn't even go into the Linux side of the house. This year, they've changed over to really getting better at getting visibility into kernel vulnerabilities. In January alone, they had a couple hundred new CVEs reported for the Linux kernel because they're now reporting everything because the Linux kernel became its own CNA. So now that they're their own reporting platform for their vulnerabilities, they're giving you better visibility into it. But that means yet another huge load of new CVEs that we have to worry about. How do we get from data overload into the finite number of actions we can take quickly to reduce that noise? That's one of the challenges.
I'm getting overwhelmed just listening to you talk about it. So let's move on to number 7, which is a similar issue. It's siloed tools and data. So again, a lot of companies for their vulnerability management practices, they have maybe multiple scanners. And each scanner has its own severity scoring. So how does a high in one scanner compare to a high in another scanner? Compare maybe to CVSS V3 high. And then sometimes, maybe there's no integration between those scanners and their patch management tools. So they're having to do all sorts of manual tasks to bring all their data together and figure out what to do with it. And it basically boils down to swivel chair management.
Right. Traditionally, you had the vulnerability scanner and the patch management solution. They weren't very tightly coupled. It was just more of a, hey, we're going to throw this report over to you. You go and figure out what needs to get done to get these resolved. Fast forward a little bit, we got to some basic integration, that vulnerability mapping that I was talking about. I could take that, 500,000 line item Excel spreadsheet and tell you, here's the 7 updates to apply to take care of 90% or better of those findings. Then you start to get to trying to modernize this. We talked about the asset concern. So now I got to bring my asset visibility into this. Now we're talking about how to prioritize better. What happens when we have multiple vulnerability scanners? Since about middle of last year, I've been hearing more and more organizations saying, okay, we're going to keep the vendor that we've been using traditionally, whether that's Qualys, Tenable, Rapid, whatever scanner you'd been using. But now that Defender has vulnerability scanning built into it, we're going to add that to the mix as well because we've already got it as part of our licensing, whatever. So now you've got multiple vulnerability sources there. If you start to look at the expanding exposure view, you could have enterprise attack surface management, so that outside in look. You could have different vulnerability scanners for different types of scenarios. So one for traditional infrastructure, one for your CI/CD pipeline. You could have one that specializes in container scanning. Each of these adds a new level of complexity, another set of tools, more data that needs to be mapped together. So if you're still lucky enough that you're only doing vulnerability and patch, yes, that's only 2 tools you have to get to work together. But you also have all the other challenges we're talking about. If you are trying to tackle those other challenges, this particular challenge exponentially grows with each set of tools you add into this and try to get cohesively working together.
Absolutely. And with that, we'll jump to number 6, resource constraints. So resource constraints make it even more difficult to deal with the other problems we mentioned so far, like the stuff you were just detailing with all these different tools. You can't simply throw bodies and budget at a problem if you don't have the bodies and you don't have the budget. And there's different sorts of resource constraints that organizations deal with. You've got that, again, budget issue. You can't afford all the tools you may need. There's personnel issues. You may have a shortage of headcount, or you might have the right number of headcount, but they're not skilled enough in the areas you need them to be. And then there's the time issue, always the time issue. So traditional vulnerability management is a really, highly manual, time-consuming, error-prone process. You've got to scan for vulnerabilities, gather your data, normalize and prepare the data, prioritize it, or we really say you're sorting it and you're just using things like CVSS, and we'll get into that later in the list. And then you've got to do your remediation and then create and distribute your reports for all your stakeholders and start the whole process over. And that takes weeks. So, Chris, any thoughts around that?
I mean, when I started my career in this space, there was, messaging the ROI, the value of, having a good patch management solution. You could save, 2 headcount by just going from manually doing some of these things into, having a solution in place to automate that. Now it's more of a, we already had staff reductions, so that's not possible anymore. But now I've got the IT generalist saying, I need to figure out how patch management becomes, 10% of my activities during the course of a month instead of 50% of my activity. There's not even multiple heads. It's just one person trying to do it all, and trying to figure out how they reduce that percentage of time they're spending on it. So it's really trying to drive, full-fledged automation with as minimal oversight as possible. But how do you get something like that even up and running? So that when we talk about the tools budget, the skills shortage, a lot of these things, it's because across the globe, we're all just tightening the resource constraints that we've got, the budget that we have to spend on tools, and everybody is having to become more of a generalist. Very few organizations still have somebody more specialized in this. Even in your vulnerability team, the person responsible for the vulnerability assessment is trying to figure out, how do I make that into 10% of my monthly activities instead of 90% of it, So it's really trying to make these things so automated that it only needs my attention when something needs to be decided upon.
So true. And that actually kind of naturally segs into problem number 5 on the list, which is the periodic approach that, vulnerability management tends to take. Because those processes are traditionally highly manual and time consuming, they tend to only be undertaken on that as needed basis. Maybe I have a compliance requirement to scan once a month, so that's what I do. Maybe my team bandwidth only allows me to do it once a month, so that's what I do. But it really needs to be continuous, because when you scan once a month, you're getting a point in time view of your, attack surface at that exact time. And you're then exposed basically the rest of the month. And to your point before, sure, a lot of what we discussed so far can be solved through automation. But again, that takes budget. And, some companies maybe aren't comfortable with automation at every phase of the process, specifically, the remediation phase. They don't want things always going out, making changes there that they're not privy to beforehand. So,
yeah. So, again, over time, we've seen this change quite a bit. When I first started, in this space, every third company you talk to had an N-1 approach to maintenance. That means I'm not going to patch everything that just came out this month. I'm actually going to start on a pilot group with that right now. And what the rest of my production environment is getting this month is last month's updates, because we were letting time be a factor in our testing. We put it into this first group, let them run for a month, and then we start to roll it out to production across the rest of the organization if everything went good. Well, fast forward to 2011, one of the biggest, most notable, data breaches that occurred. And fast forwarding from there, we hit this exponential increase in the number of exploited vulnerabilities and reduction in the time it takes to exploit a vulnerability. Most organizations now have at least 2 SLAs. You've got a 14-day SLA for critical and probably high vulnerabilities to get resolved in your environment. And then you've got a 0-day response SLA, where if you decide something needs to get responded to sooner, typically you've got about 48 hours to get that 0-day burning down towards compliant. Fast forward to the near future here, you're going to have at least 3 SLAs you're going to be dealing with. There's going to be my regular maintenance. That's going to be my 14-day SLA. That typically comes around once a month. I know it kind of sounds weird, but 14 days from the starting point, And that trigger point is, when is my OS up maintenance going to occur that month? So Microsoft's Patch Tuesday being the most definitive one. The second SLA is going to be what are considered more priority updates. How do you get to a more aggressive stance on responding to all of these third-party apps that just continuously release? We get Chrome updates weekly now. That means Chrome and Edge every week. Firefox updates at least 2 to 3 times a month. That means every week we've got 2 to 3 browser updates that need to be done. If we've got a 14-day SLA on critical vulnerabilities, that means every week we start a new cadence of that 14-day SLA. So you're going to have a track that's running continuous on top of your monthly maintenance. And then you still have that 0-day response. We're always going to see the next headline. So how to shift from periodic to continuous, everybody is scrambling to figure out how to make that not just we could kind of do it, into like nope, we're fully configured to do this on a daily basis, and we can step away and say this is truly automated. That's what people are striving towards right now.
Absolutely. And that'll be good fodder for our next episode.
Yes.
All right. That brings us to number 4 in our top 10 problems with vulnerability management: poor prioritization methods. CVSS and scanner severity scores are really the primary methods through which organizations are prioritizing activities for remediation of their exposures. So the problem with those is they're based on severity, not risk. So they're based on how easily a vulnerability could hypothetically be exploited based on its technical characteristics, not on risk, which tells you which ones have been exploited or are currently actively being exploited in the wild. That's what you need to worry about. What we've seen at Ivanti with some of our research is we've compared CVSS V3 scores to what we call vulnerability risk ratings, which is a proprietary risk scoring method we've come up with. We've seen that CVSS overstates criticality of vulnerabilities at a 7-to-1 clip when you're talking just CVSS scores versus a risk-based scoring. So you're doing 7 times the work to remediate all those vulnerabilities. And you also have the flip side where sometimes it's rating what, from a risk perspective, is a critical as a medium. And then what you're seeing is that those vulnerabilities are going to go unfixed at an organization that uses CVSS V3 as its standard for prioritization. And then you're, in that scenario, indefinitely exposed to the risk that those exposures pose.
So let me throw the simplest example at you of how traditional scoring fails us. If you haven't tuned into our monthly Patch Tuesday webinar series, I recommend you do so. Microsoft is probably the easiest example to see this truly in action. If you look at the last couple of years, almost every month, Microsoft has at least one 0-day to respond to, actively exploited before they got the fix in place. That's how they knew about it, was somebody started attacking it. If you look at the last couple of years, they're averaging about 20 a year. Only about one of those each year is rated critical. The rest of them are rated important, or occasionally there's 1 or 2 moderates in the mix as well. That's the new reality, is majority of actively exploited vulnerabilities are not critical. They're below a CVSS score of 8.0. And if you're still using critical and CVSS 8.0 and above, you are blind to all the things that are actively attacking your environment.
Well put. Say no more. Let's go to number 3. Number 3 on our top 10 problems with vulnerability management is that it ignores business context. So traditional vulnerability management approaches prior to prioritization focus only on vulnerabilities. That's what we were just talking about. They don't focus on the organizations that they may impact. So every organization has a risk appetite, which we define as the level of cyber risk an organization is prepared to accept in pursuit of its business objectives. That risk appetite needs to be considered when making any cybersecurity type of decision. You know, it's not just applicable to financial decisions and operational decisions. It's cybersecurity as well. But part of the reason it hasn't been is because historically, vulnerability management has strictly been the domain of IT and security teams with no real input from the business side. And part of the reason for that is that security teams have struggled to effectively communicate the impact of vulnerability management to the business side. And I don't want to get too far ahead of myself before giving Chris a chance to pipe in here.
So another good example coming out of that Patch Tuesday, we just had a conversation with a company who asked me a very direct and very interesting question. So those of you familiar with NTLM authentication, Microsoft deprecated that last year. And going forward, they're going to be starting to phase that out. In fact, Windows 11 by default had it disabled. So if you wanted to keep using NTLM on Windows 11, you had to specifically turn it back on. Well, at some point, they're going to disable that completely. His question to me was, how do I have the conversation with the business to explain why we need to make sure we're off of NTLM? That's the challenge we have here is today, the vulnerability management program, whether it's on the security or the IT side, they're really just doing execution of operational, execution across the environment. We got a finding, we go remediate. We got a finding, we go to remediate. Oh, you want to do a 0 day? Okay, we're going to scramble, talk to a bunch of people and figure out, can we remediate sooner? Maybe. We don't get into the right level of business context around these things. How could we say NTLM is required for this business critical application, which happens to, have a price tag on it? You can quantify these things. I've got a system that is worth $4 million of revenue per hour to the business. If that goes down, we start losing money very quickly, right? I mean, those are some big numbers just to put it in a frame of reference. But if that is the system that's running on NTLM, and when NTLM goes away, it's inoperable, now we have some real quantifiable business risk. $4 million an hour. If we continue on this, it will be exposed to increasing risk over time of being attacked because of the weaknesses of NTLM. That's what we mean by business context. How do we frame this up in a way where we can quickly and easily understand this exposure is impacting us at this level? Do we fix it, or do we make an exception to carry on? Because if we try to fix it, we're going to break something else. That's the business context we need.
Absolutely. And yeah, that's the important part of incorporating that business context is the answer isn't always go fix everything. Sometimes the answer is accept the risk. And where I was headed when we started off on number 3, I was kind of leading down this path, which leads us to number 2, which is poor metrics and reporting, which are a real problem with vulnerability management. And traditional metrics in vulnerability management are really activity-based. MTTD, MTTR, all the MTTX metrics. They tell you, here are all the things I did and how fast I did them. Teams need to rethink the metrics and KPIs they use in terms of business impact. They need to be outcome-based. By doing X, we accomplished Y, or by doing X, we prevented Z from happening. Executives want to know their return on security investment and the cost benefit of the different decisions they're making. And that's not a condemnation of security teams. Every team struggles with this in an organization. Marketing, HR, you name it. It's a business-wide problem, but one that needs to be solved to be effective.
Right. Yeah. So an interesting story that came from one of our customers last year. He shared a story with me about their CEO got up at their kickoff earlier that year in start of 2024 and told the organization that in the last quarter, they remediated 3.5 million vulnerabilities. This was that kind of a stake in the ground. We've been doing a huge amount of work. And what that means is we're reducing our risk of data breaches, ransomware attacks, et cetera, et cetera. So getting close to, by doing X, by resolving 3.5 million vulnerabilities this last quarter, we did Y. We accomplished protecting ourselves. We are seeing a reduction in major security incidents across our organization. That's the level of maturity that many organizations are striving towards. We're not quite there yet as an industry, but it's exactly the type of metrics we need to do. That way, when you do have that conversation next year about budget for tools, headcount, other things like that, you can now quantify the time and effort spent being a tangible business value.
Right on. And with that, we get to the last item on our list of the top 10 problems with vulnerability management. And Chris, I'm just going to announce this one and throw it right to you because, I mean, this is your true area of expertise. So number one is remediation primarily through patch management. Chris, take it away.
Yeah. So here's where we run into all sorts of trouble. There's a lot of vulnerabilities out there that are patchable. There's a subset of those that are easily patchable. So easily patchable, that's the things like, yes, a patch management solution like the Ivanti, your OS updates, your third-party applications, all those things easily patchable. What happens when you've got appliances in your network infrastructure? I don't just go and apply a bunch of updates to my load balancers and my firewalls and all sorts of other things, off the cuff. That's going to be, in fact, I've got a friend in this space in the medical industry. When he goes and does updates, he basically has a cot in his office and he's setting up shop for the next 24 to 48 hours. And there's a team of people on a call bridge working through each of these devices, getting upgraded, rule changes, troubleshooting, all sorts of complexity that comes into that. What happens if it's in our web application if I'm a bank and I'm providing a banking app to my customers, that's being developed internally. You're using third-party libraries. What about vulnerabilities in those? How about a business critical application, that application we talked about that's worth $4 million an hour to the business? Well, there's a whole bunch of customization in that. It's got a solution behind the scenes like SAP. It's got a bunch of middleware integrations with other data technologies and other things in there. If I need to update part of that, it's a business owner, product manager or project manager, some dev and QA people, possibly collaboration with a third party for some of that as well, maybe consulting, other things like that. This could be a multi-day, week, month type project. Very few organizations have gotten to the point where their vulnerability management program goes to the point where it fully encompasses all exposures across their organization. Most are still in that traditional mode of traditional vulnerability patch remediation. Maybe some do the traditional vulnerability into a little bit of configuration management from time to time, but getting into that larger, we've got everything encompassed in one comprehensive view across our entire environment, across exposures, is pretty rare right now.
Spot on. And with that brings us to the end of our list. So that's all for this episode. But we don't want to just drop all these problems on everyone. And that's basically the opposite of what we're trying to do on this podcast. So, Chris, you hinted at this in the opening. This is sort of the beginning of a 3-episode arc here. So over the next 2 episodes, we're going to get into how you go about solving some of these problems. And with that, Chris, take us out.
All right. Thank you, Robert. And thank you all for joining us once again on another episode of Security Insights. As always, feel free to share this episode if you like what you heard or you think it's interesting and somebody else could use this information. It always does help us get our visibility up as well when you share that out. And next month, we'll be back with another all-new Security Insights topic covering the continuation of this discussion. As Robert mentioned, we're going to go into some more depth around some of these pain points and really talk a lot more in depth about how you go about trying to solve these challenges. So until then, stay safe, stay secure.